Welcome back, everyone. This is Treks to Nowhere. In this episode, I'd like to share with you the story of NAZMAT. Now, despite how it might sound, NAZMAT does not relate in any way to hazardous materials. Rather, it is an acronym for a multi day group event known as the Northern Arizona Motorcycle Adventure Tour. Now, the timing of this episode is rather apropos, as the 2024 NAZMAT event is fast approaching in just a few months. Plans are being hatched and new routes are being finalized for this year's gathering, but for this episode, I'm going to spend our time taking you all back to the beginning. I would like to share with you all how the concept of NAZMAT came into being, how it was developed and designed, and in a sense tested, and how it ultimately evolved into a several-day group adventure ride along some of the best backcountry routes in northern Arizona. In addition, I'm going to share with you all the detailed story of the inaugural 2022 NAZMAT event and how the entire adventure tragically came to an abrupt end due to an unexpected natural disaster. Now, you may recall back in episode 19 of the first season, I spoke at length about my personal history with motorcycles and how a chance meeting in the San Juan Mountains of Colorado ultimately led me back to two-wheeled adventuring after a nearly 20-year hiatus. In that episode, I took you through my entire history, starting with my very first motorcycle, a 1978 Honda Twin Star that I learned to ride at 16 years old, and then up through my more recent purchase of my first adventure bike in 2020, a Royal Enfield Himalayan. In that episode, I spent a lot of time talking about the why. Since coming back to motorcycles a few years ago, I have found incredible joy exploring where I can, mostly within the forest and along primitive trails. Since coming back to these adventures, I have now ridden well over 15,000 miles on two wheels, exploring some of the most remote and obscure nooks of the Southwest and amongst the Rocky Mountains. Episode 19 ended with a discussion of one of my favorite places to ride, Harding Point, and it was precisely because of Harding Point that the idea of NAZMAT was born. Standing on the remote overlook at Harding Point, I was overcome with a feeling that I wanted to share with others these beautiful and poignant places that I am so fortunate to explore and experience. I wanted others to know the joy of riding along forest roads and trails that are deep in the woods and that don't explicitly end, per se, but rather diminish and diffuse into the wilderness. There is an indescribable type of awe and wonder that comes with the realization that the trail you have been so diligently following has somehow been reabsorbed and assimilated, and in a way that was imperceptible. In a brief moment of clarity, you have the realization, wait, what happened to the trail I was just on? It is precisely then that you truly feel as though you've been allowed into a place not known by others, a true guest of the wilds, a visitor to a dimension of the wilderness not immediately apparent to the world under normal circumstances. You see, it is these places and these types of treks to nowhere that cannot be truly described in words, but must be experienced. And I wanted to bring that experience to others. And so I hatched a plan. I wanted to create an invitational group ride of sorts where anyone could join me. Anyone could ride out with me to these small nooks in the forest, these unseen geographic oddities, and feel their awe and somewhat paradoxical enormity. In February of 2021, still deep within the relative peak of the COVID-19 pandemic, I found myself in the throes of a protracted quarrel with a very long and cold winter that I was desperately trying to outlast. My Himalayan motorcycle had been in winter storage for almost 3 months by this point, and I was incredibly anxious to get it fired up and get out for a ride. The biggest issue with winter riding in Flagstaff is that not only does the U.S. Forest Service close nearly all wilderness roads, but the city does not use salt for ice mitigation. They instead use small cinder rocks. What this means is that our roads not only stay icier for longer, but those that are rideable have layers of loose gravels to contend with. Of course, being at 7,000 feet elevation, our winters are also just really dang cold. It's hard to focus on the joy of riding when the outside ambient temperatures are in the single digits. So, as a way to keep my frustrations and discouragement at bay, I chose to channel my two wheeled anxiousness into something productive: the design and development of a formalized group ride. After some quick web searching, I learned that there were no existing rides in the area similar to what I was envisioning. So I jumped into the planning headfirst, and with my usual level of fervor and obsessive dedication. By the end of that first day, I had already decided on a name: the Northern Arizona Motorcycle Adventure Tour, or better known by its acronym, NAZMAT. I had also purchased a domain name, compiled countless photos and video clips from my many previous rides, and started scripting text for what would ultimately become the event's website. Over the next several weeks, I spent countless hours developing four unique routes that I felt best highlighted all that Northern Arizona has to offer. I booked group campground sites. I set up a newsletter. I even published an interest video online and spread the word of the event on countless internet forums and motorcycle bulletin boards. I went so far as to create a specialized difficulty rating scale and wrote up detailed descriptions of every mile of the proposed routes. I spent days in mapping software creating GPX files for both my primary routes and also for a handful of reroutes that allow beginners to skip a few of the more difficult sections. On the website, I published the following text alongside a submission form that interested parties could use to indicate their desire to attend. The website read: NAZMAT is a 4-day motorcycle adventure tour that features some of the best backroads, hidden treasures, and scenic wonders that Northern Arizona has to offer. The routes are specifically designed to keep things fun and interesting and to get riders off of the beaten path. NAZMAT is for riders, by riders, so participation is entirely free. The tour will be based out of the scenic mountain town of Flagstaff, Arizona, and riders will explore a different surrounding region each day, starting and ending in Flagstaff proper. Each day of riding will cover between 80 and 120 miles and will be over varied terrain. This tour is designed for all ADV riders, so there will be no extreme technical portions for any of the routes, but rest assured, there are still plenty of moderate technical sections that will keep you on your toes and provide for some exciting riding. If beginner riders are not comfortable with some of these technical sections, there will be published alternate reroutes for those sections. Each day will also feature many scenic destinations and side trips, both planned and spontaneous. There will be enough time each day for riders to document footage, motovlog, eat lunches or snacks, or just to enjoy the scenery. Maps, GPS tracks, and other resources will all be available for the rides on this website. In addition, most of the area surrounding Flagstaff is part of the Coconino National Forest, so open camping is generally permitted anywhere that is not private property. There will also be a group full-service campsite booked and available to all riders. One additional note to consider is that Flagstaff is located at 7,000 feet, so plan accordingly if you think that you may need time to acclimate to the elevation. Lastly, each day will generally start around 8 a.m. with the goal of completing that day's route by 5 p.m. For those that are interested, we will also plan to conclude each day by gathering after the ride at a local restaurant, cafe, or pub to exchange stories from the day and to simply enjoy good food, beverage, and company. For the 2 months leading up to the event, I would go out every weekend to ride my planned routes on what I was calling my NAZMAT reconnaissance rides, so that I could record both video footage but also official GPX routes to share with the riders. I also wanted to make sure that I knew every mile of my planned routes and that I wasn't going to be presenting some horrifically difficult or technical Class 5 section of trail to my fellow riders. After about a month of my recon rides, I published everything to the website and then waited. Slowly, the emails and form responses started trickling in, and before long, I had a spreadsheet of over 15 riders interested in attending. It was now getting real. Of course, there was a part of me that was constantly debating and worried that my routes wouldn't be good enough or that they would be too difficult for some riders or too easy for others. But there wasn't much I could really do about that. It's impossible to accommodate everyone perfectly when you're dealing with so many different skill levels of adventure riders. I published all of the updated GPX files online and then just sat back and waited for the June weekend to arrive. It wasn't long, however, before small problems started to emerge. First, I had many interested riders pull out within 2 weeks of the ride for various personal reasons. By the time the ride came upon us, there would only be 6 of us in total actually starting on the first day. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing, though, and certainly made for a more reasonable riding group size, but it did mean that I lost a lot of money on the campsites that I had booked. Additionally, a few weeks before the ride, a pair of large wildfires had ignited outside of town in the area that I had planned for us to ride on our third day. I knew the forest would now be closed in those areas well past our ride dates, so I had to scramble to come up with a new plan for the third and fourth days. Again, not a showstopper, but certainly not ideal, especially with it all happening so close to the event date. In the end, I decided to simply move day 4 up on the schedule and come up with a new plan for the last day depending on what people wanted. I did have a few alternate routes ready to go on standby and tucked away in my proverbial back pocket. When the first day arrived, we planned to meet at the Woody Mountain Campground store. I designed day 1 so that it would start off with some very mild dirt roads and take us back to a famous vista point in the area known as Edge of the World. From this vantage point, one can look down over 2,000 feet of elevation into the Sedona Valley. It's a spectacular view and would make for an excellent first stop. From there, the route would have us weaving through the forest on mostly easy and moderate difficulty roads. This would also allow me to assess the skill level of the riders and make subtle changes if needed. I did, after all, know just about every road in these woods. In the afternoon, we'd head out to my favorite place, Harding Point. Now, I was eager to share this magical place with the other riders, and I only hoped that they would appreciate its beauty as much as I have. At the conclusion of the day, we'd eventually head back up to Flagstaff after first making one last stop at the Oak Creek Canyon Vista Lookout. The entire route would be about 80 miles and would make for a great warm-up day with incredible views. I felt like this was a good plan, considering that day 2 would present significantly more challenging segments. Now, to say I was excited to get riding would be an enormous understatement. As those 5 other riders arrived to the campground store, I remember thinking that all of the hard work that I had done was finally paying off, and we were about to embark. Before we left the parking area, I checked in with everyone and gave them all the quick rundown for the morning. We'd head the 30 or so miles out to Edge of the World on relatively easy forest roads. I was expecting to ease back, ride somewhat slowly, and just enjoy the morning. And so, we all fired our bikes up, and we began heading down Woody Mountain Road en route to Edge of the World. As this was the first segment of the first day, I chose to take the lead. And of course, this meant that I was dusting all of the other riders out, as it had been exceedingly dry in the past month. This is a very important point to remember when we eventually get to day 2, so keep that in mind. Woody Mountain Road was heavily washboarded and meant for some bumpy riding, but no one was complaining. We did eventually get on the more primitive dual track roads about 10 miles short of the primary vista point, and the riding became much smoother. By this point, I was thoroughly enjoying myself and would often point to key features along the ride for others to take note of. Things like prominent limestone outcrop formations or a stray elk in the woods. In these early morning moments, I was truly feeling grateful and on cloud 9. But then, it happened. We had our first hiccup of sorts. As we neared the final vista point at the edge of the world, I peered in my rearview mirror and noticed that all of my companions were now gone. My first assumption was that someone took a mild spill in some of the sand that we had just ridden through about a half mile back, so I stopped to see if they'd catch up. After about a minute, though, with no sign of my friends, I spun around and retraced my steps back. Not far behind on the road, I came upon the group, all pulled over with their bikes turned off. I pulled up to assess the situation and was informed that one of our riders, Greg, was having trouble with his bike. It had stalled and now wasn't starting. Thankfully, we had a team of 6 riders, all with varying levels of motorcycle maintenance acumen, that could help to troubleshoot the problem. As we poured over Greg's bike, going through the usual gamut of electrical and fuel system checks, we eventually discovered that somehow his engine kill switch had shorted itself out in the off position. What this means is that his bike was being electrically prohibited from starting. With some minor tweaking, we were able to get into the handlebar assembly and bypass the switch altogether, allowing the bike to fire up successfully, but the entire ordeal cost us about an hour of time. I'll admit, in some ways it was fun troubleshooting an issue like this, and I had of course assumed that we'd need to deal with at least one minor issue over the 4 days of riding, but it was a little frustrating that it happened so early on in the first day. We all shook it off and continued on up to the edge of the world vista point. Once there, we took a snack break and marveled at the spectacular views. I had already forgotten about our lost hour as soon as I stepped out onto the escarpment of the Mogollon Rim overlooking the Sedona Valley floor. Everyone else also seemed to be impressed with this view, so I felt like I had delivered a premier experience already on the first day. After a short break and with some calories now in us, we pushed on into more of the remote areas of the forest that I had laid out for the first day. As the morning gave way to early afternoon, the route became more remote and technical. There were smiles to be had all around, and everyone was expressing their approval of the routes I had designed. As we neared a place known as Turkey Butte, there is a fairly steep climb. I let the other riders know to keep on the throttle during this climb, but once on top, things would become much easier and level out. I punched it a bit and made the climb, giggling for a fair amount of it, but when I reached the top, I was again alone. I waited for a few minutes, but when no one came, I suspected the worst, that someone had dropped their bike on the climb. I turned around and headed back down the hill to find Greg pulled over at the bottom of the climb, again with a disabled bike. This time, the fix wasn't so simple. We spent the next hour troubleshooting his bike, but after nearly every effort, including swapping out spark plugs and various relays, we concluded that his bike just wasn't going to start, and that the likely culprit was his fuel pump. We all couldn't believe the crummy luck that Greg was having with his bike, and I felt absolutely terrible for him. But this also meant we were now deep in the woods with a disabled bike. What now? One of the other riders, who also lives in the area, called up his partner and asked her to bring a trailer out to us to haul Greg out. It was our only real option at this point. So we all parked it on the side of the road and waited for another hour for the trailer to arrive. Thankfully, the road out to Turkey Butte is accessible by truck, so this plan ultimately worked, but it meant we would only have time for one quick and more direct visit over to Harding Point before we would need to head back to town. So I was again incredibly deflated. Things had been going so well, and now we had 2 full breakdowns in the first day alone. It was frustrating. The good news is that once Greg was all taken care of, we did decide as a group to make the jaunt over to Harding Point and continue on with the day. I tried to convey to the gang that despite the rough day, ending on Harding Point would be a nice highlight. Given the lost time on the day, we did have to take a more direct route over to Harding Point, but when we got there, I was finally able to share one of my favorite rides in all of Flagstaff, and with a fellow group of riding enthusiasts. Now, while this was very rewarding, I still couldn't help shake the funk that I was in, knowing that we had 2 breakdowns already and a member of our group was already leaving to go back to Phoenix. We were now down to 5. Thankfully, Harding Point didn't disappoint. We had a great late afternoon ride along the remote forest roads, dancing around fallen tree branches and other obstacles, and eventually made it up to the point without any additional issues. I'll never forget what one of the other riders, Ben, said once we were at the point. He said, "This is some beautiful country up here, and so peaceful." This, of course, is exactly how I feel about Harding Point as well, and I was simply thrilled that someone else also got it. After a 20-minute break at the point, we enjoyed a pleasant ride back out of the forest and into town. Despite the troubles of the day, we managed to end the first chapter of our adventure on a relative high point. Given this, I was feeling cautiously optimistic about day 2. Now, for the second day, we'd be heading up north from town to an area known as Wing Mountain, and then eventually on towards Kendrick Peak, the second highest mountain in the area. I would be taking the riders on significantly more technical roads and even stop by one of our famous lava tube caves for lunch. In the afternoon, after going around Kendrick Peak, we'd ride up to the summit of Saddle Mountain on a precariously perched road before finally heading back to town to end the day. It would be a day of almost 100 total miles, and it was going to also be a day of non-stop thrills. In the morning, we rallied at the base of the San Francisco Peaks in the lower parking lot for the Snow Bowl ski area. While Greg did opt to trailer his bike back to Phoenix, we were joined by another new local rider, so our numbers were back up to 6. We began the day under beautiful clear skies by heading over to the Wing Mountain area. I was incredibly excited to tackle one of my favorite stretches of Class 3 forest road in this area. This would be the first extended stretch of difficult trail, but given what I saw the previous day, I had no doubt everyone in the group would tackle it successfully. In truth, I was more worried about the climb up to the saddle of Kendrick Peak later in the day, which would present us all with some of the only Class 4 riding of the long weekend. But we'd cross that proverbial bridge when we got there. For now, it was about warming up and getting ready for the Wing Mountain roads. And this is when the first problem arose. Somehow, despite my highly detailed planning, I had routed us along a small segment of trail that I had never actually ridden before. This was entirely due to misplacing the track line in my GPS software when I was cleaning up the routes for publication. It was such a small stretch of only about 2 miles that I simply missed it when proofreading all of the materials. Up to this point, the morning had been going great, and we were about 5 miles short of my favorite stretch when we collectively turned onto this new 2-mile unfamiliar stretch. It only took me about a half mile into the stretch before I realized that it was unfamiliar and I pulled over. I had a quick meeting with the gang informing them that this was all just a simple mistake and that we could either choose to go back the way we came to the main road or push on and pop out the other end where we were supposed to about a mile and a half further down. Everyone happily agreed to just push on as it was only another mile and a half and the road hadn't been too difficult. However, this all changed right about when we got to the halfway point of the segment. Suddenly, the road became a minefield of enormous volcanic rocks and stepped up to near Class 5 difficulty, well outside my level of comfort. By now, though, we were somewhat committed, and regardless of our course of action from this point, we were going to have to deal with some difficult riding. One of the other riders in our group was riding a Suzuki dual sport bike, much better outfitted and suited for off-road terrain. He volunteered to ride on and scope out the route ahead, but by this point, one of our other riders had already dropped her bike. Of course, I was expecting that there'd be at least some drops during the NAZMAT event. I didn't expect that they'd come as a direct result of my routing errors. So here we were, early on into day 2, and I was already frustrated and feeling terrible at how things were playing out. After scoping the road ahead, we did determine collectively that it was actually smoother to continue on. And we did eventually make it back to the primary route without any additional incidents, and shortly after, we were finally tackling the extended stretch that I was eager for earlier in the day. By this point, though, we'd already gone through a segment that was even more difficult, so it almost felt a bit underwhelming. But still, my spirits were slowly beginning to lift again. We did avoid major catastrophe, and no one's bike broke down. As the day pressed on, we stopped at the lava tube cave for a quick spell of spelunking and then carried on to the Kendrick Peak section. This ended up being the absolute apex of the day, and we all made it up and around Kendrick without any bike drops and full of big smiles. I finally found myself truly enjoying the riding, and it seemed like everyone else was having a blast. But, given how the events had unfolded up to this point, I was just waiting for that other shoe to drop. And boy, did it drop. As we were all riding out from Kendrick Peak and heading towards Saddle Mountain, we were casually making our way down a Class 1 forest road. Smiles were wide, spirits were high, and as we rounded the final curve in the road before reaching the paved Route 180, I saw it. Above the canopy of trees, I saw what appeared to be a looming and billowing cumulus cloud. As the trees parted momentarily in an open field, however, I realized that it wasn't a rain cloud, but rather an enormous mushroom cloud of wildfire smoke. Having lived in Arizona for over 3 years by this point, I had seen my fair share of wildfires, and I instantly knew what I was looking at. And it was massive. My spirits came crashing down in an instant, and I knew what the ramifications of such a wildfire would be for our ride and for our community. When we made it out to the highway, we finally got a good look at the extent of the fire, and it was ridiculously expansive. From our vantage point, it looked like the entirety of the San Francisco peaks were on fire. We pulled over to gather ourselves, and while I checked my phone for updates, Ben came to a rather sudden and horrific realization. You see, Ben had set up his own campsite for the ride right in the area that the smoke was billowing from. He had a full camper van with a trailer parked high up in the forest on the flank of the mountains, and so immediately took off to check on the status of his camp. We all waited and wondered, trying to choreograph our next move. In about 20 minutes, Ben was already back and with discouraging news. Not only had the Forest Service closed all of the roads up to his campsite, and so he'd have no way to get to his gear, but most of the National Forest roads were closing as well. Not only would the remainder of the afternoon riding now be in question, but almost all of the routes that I had planned for day 3 would likely be closed. It was precisely at this moment that I realized whatever NAZMAT was still holding on was now effectively over. Reluctantly, I told everyone it was probably best if we just parted ways and that Ben could stay with me at my place until the Forest Service would allow him back to see if his van and campsite were still standing. Surprisingly, though, Ben's attitude was something of a c'est la vie, and he argued that we might as well finish our ride up to Saddle Mountain since there wasn't much else we could do. I was frankly shocked that he still wanted to ride, but figured maybe it was his way of coping or just his way of keeping his mind off of his camper van. The group was surprisingly supportive of this idea, so in the one area of the route still open and safe from the fires, we headed out on the long and technical road up to the summit of Saddle Mountain. In truth, it was a fantastic and exhilarating ride, but it definitely felt like a NAZMAT grand finale, as I knew this would be the last ride of the event. On the summit, we were able to get incredible views of the fire, and it was the largest I had ever seen in my 3+ years in the area. It was going to be devastating to the Flagstaff community, and the monsoon floods and debris flows that would follow were likely to be catastrophic. It did ultimately take over 2 weeks for the Forest Service to get the fires out, and when the July rains did come, they caused enormous flood damage to multiple communities in the area. Even today, several years later, the burn scar is clearly visible, draping more than half of the San Francisco peaks. The worst part of the entire story was that the fire was human caused, started when someone decided it was a good idea to ignite their garbage. Back to the NAZMAT story, once we descended Saddle Mountain, we all decided to call it. Ben rode home with me to my place and stayed for over 2 nights while the fire crews worked on the fire. On the third day, the Flagstaff sheriff did escort Ben up to his campsite, where it was somehow thankfully spared. He was able to get out everything safely and drive back to the Phoenix area. For me, the tragedy of that fire still weighs on our community, and it's hard not to associate it with NAZMAT. Despite the moments of pure joy on those first few days, there were many moments of frustration that make it hard now to reflect positively back on it all. It's because of this that when the following spring came around, I had no desire to try a group ride again. It felt like karma and fate had already told me that NAZMAT should be shelved. And as such, I decided to not hold a group ride in 2023. But this year, something just feels different. This year, I do want to give it another honest go, and I've already been reworking my routes and sending out invitations. I decided that I can't dwell on the incidents of 2022, and I still desperately want to share these beautiful roads and trails with others. So, in just 2 short months, I will gather outside a local coffee shop here in town, hopefully with several other riders, and head out once again into the forest with an eager attitude and wide smile. The roads and trails have most certainly been calling to me this year, and in the wise words of John Muir, I must go. I can only hope that what transpires falls more squarely on the side of joy and excitement. And that, my friends, is the story of the Northern Arizona Motorcycle Adventure Tour, a seemingly adventurous and exhilarating group ride that tragically ended abruptly due to one of the most devastating wildfires in Flagstaff's history. So thank you. Thank you for following along with me on this rather unique trek to nowhere, and I look forward to posting an updated episode one day in the future that highlights this year's upcoming event. Hopefully, that episode will feature notably more highs than lows. I suppose it's worth noting that looking back on all of this, one really important takeaway that we will come back to several times in future episodes is that not every adventure necessarily goes as planned, and some are even cut short early or completely altered. And sometimes they end before they even start. We are just not going to reach every destination as planned, and we should always endeavor to embrace the joyous or special moments when they do come. In the next episode, episode 15, we're going to revisit a pair of centuries, so to speak. Now, of course, I don't mean two different 100-year periods of time in our past, but rather we'll look back at the first century bicycle ride I ever carried out back in 2015 on a rather mediocre commuter bike and while also woefully out of shape. We'll also revisit a second century ride that I carried out several years later and how these two rides were in some ways connected in spirit. Take care, everyone, and be safe out there.